Most people picture Resurrection Sunday as a bright morning, serene women carrying flowers toward a fragrant garden. The truth is something else entirely. What actually happened in those pre-dawn hours required crossing the frozen darkness of Jerusalem with bodies wrecked by 2 days of grief, carrying over 30 kilograms of burial spices, and confronting a 2-ton stone sealed by order of Rome. This is the story you were never told. Put into perspective what Jerusalem was during that week. This was not an ordinary city on an ordinary day. It was Passover, Pesach, and the city's permanent population of roughly 40 to 80,000 had swollen to somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people compressed inside and around its walls. Pilgrims from Judea, Galilee, Syria, Egypt, and Rome itself slept in improvised tents on the Mount of Olives, in Bethany, in the valleys surrounding the city. Tens of thousands of lambs had been slaughtered at the temple on Friday afternoon, between 3 and 6 o'clock, flooding the courtyard drainage channels with blood. The air across the entire city smelled of iron and burning fat. That was the setting. And in the middle of all that crowd, a man had been publicly executed the Friday before. The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth lasted approximately 6 hours. Mark chapter 15 verse 25 records that he was nailed to the cross at around 9 in the morning. Matthew chapter 27 verses 46 through 50 records that he died at around 3 in the afternoon. 6 hours. That may sound like a long time, but in reality it was astonishingly fast. Roman crucifixion was designed to kill slowly. The average was 24 to 48 hours of agony. Some condemned men lasted 3 days. Jesus died in a quarter of that time, and Pontius Pilate himself was surprised. Mark chapter 15, verse 44, records that the prefect summoned the centurion to confirm whether the prisoner was already dead. He was. The body that came down from the cross that Friday afternoon bore no resemblance to the body that had entered Jerusalem riding a donkey 5 days earlier. Consider the accumulated physical destruction. The night before in Gethsemane, Luke chapter 22 verse 44, records that Jesus' sweat became like drops of blood, a real medical condition called hematidrosis, triggered by extreme stress, rupturing subcutaneous capillaries. Then came an entire night without sleep, being transferred between the Sanhedrin, Pilate, and Herod. Then the Roman flogging with the flagrum, a whip of leather strips embedded with pieces of bone and metal at the ends. Jewish tradition limited lashes to 39 strokes, as prescribed in Deuteronomy chapter 25. In verse 3, but Roman flogging had no defined limit. The strips tore away skin and muscle from the back, causing massive blood loss and hypovolemic shock. Then soldiers drove a crown of thorns into his head, causing cranial hemorrhage. Then he carried the patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam, weighing between 30 and 50 kilograms, approximately 600 meters through the streets of Jerusalem, from the Praetorium to Golgotha. He fell along the way. A man named Simon of Cyrene was conscripted to carry the beam in his place, as recorded in Mark chapter 15, verse 21. And only then came the cross itself. The nails did not go through the palms of the hands. The only direct archaeological evidence of crucifixion ever found, the calcaneus of Yehohanan, discovered in 1968 in a 1st century tomb in Jerusalem, shows an 11.5 centimeter nail driven through the heel bone. Modern anatomical research indicates that the nails for the upper limbs were driven through the wrist, between the carpal bones, because the palms of the hands would simply tear under the weight of the body. The article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in March 1986 by physicians Edwards, Gable, and Hosmer detailed the mechanisms of death by crucifixion, progressive asphyxiation, cardiac failure, shock. With each breath, the crucified man had to push his body upward by pressing against the nails in his feet, When muscular exhaustion prevented that movement, the lungs ceased to function. Jesus died before that process ran its full course. His body was already too destroyed. A Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear. John chapter 19 verse 34 records that blood and water came out. The most widely accepted medical interpretation is that the spear perforated the pericardial sac, releasing accumulated serous fluid, what is known as pericardial effusion, followed by blood from the ventricle. That clinical detail confirms the heart had already stopped. Jesus was dead before the lance struck. Silence. Now observe what happened in the hours that followed, because time was the real enemy. It was approximately 3 in the afternoon. The sun would set around 6:55. With sunset, the Sabbath would begin, and all work would be forbidden. That gave Joseph of Arimathea, the member of the Sanhedrin who had not consented to the condemnation, as Luke chapter 23, verse 51, records, fewer than 4 hours to obtain authorization from Pilate, take the body down from the cross, transport it, prepare the burial, and seal the tomb. Fewer than 4 hours to accomplish what would normally require an entire day. Joseph was not alone. John chapter 19, verses 38 through 40, records that Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 Roman litri. Each litra was approximately 327 grams. The total came to nearly 33 kilograms of spices. For context, that is more than 10 times the quantity used in a common burial of the period. It is the weight of a 10-year-old child. Only kings received that kind of funerary honor. 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 14, describes the burial of King Asa with a similarly abundant quantity of spices. The myrrh came from the resin of the Commiphora myrrha, a thorny tree from the Horn of Africa and Arabia. Its scent was warm, woody, and bitter. The aloes, in this context, were not the succulent plant familiar today, but the powdered aromatic wood of Aquilaria agalocha, imported from the Far East. Both substances were laid in layers between the strips of linen that wrapped the body, band by band, from the feet to the neck. The face received a separate cloth, the sudarium. The cost of all this material represented a fortune. For reference, the flask of nard that Mary had used to anoint Jesus' feet days earlier, as recorded in John chapter 12, verse 5, was valued at 300 denarii, the equivalent of an entire year's wages for a common laborer. Consider the scale of the place where they laid the body. The tomb of Joseph of Arimathea was new, hewn from limestone, as Matthew chapter 27 verse 60 records. Archaeologists Amos Kloner and Boaz Zissou catalogued around 900 tombs from the Second Temple period in the Jerusalem region. The architecture was standardized. The entrance measured between 60 and 90 centimeters in height and 50 to 70 centimeters in width. You had to stoop to enter. The interior held a main chamber approximately 2 meters by 3 meters, with a ceiling height of 1.5 to 2 meters. Standing fully upright was impossible in many of them. The burial bench where the body was laid measured roughly 1 meter 80 in length by 60 centimeters in width. The internal temperature of the limestone held steady between 15 and 17 degrees, even on the warmest days. The air inside smelled of damp stone and, after the burial, of myrrh and aloes in dense concentration. The tomb was extraordinarily close to the site of the crucifixion. John chapter 19, verses 41 and 42, records that in the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb. Excavations at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre confirm that the distance between the rocky outcrop identified as Golgotha and the tomb site is approximately 40 to 50 meters, less than half a football pitch. That proximity was providential, given the urgency of the burial. But there remains one element to reveal: the one that transformed that tomb from an ordinary sepulchre into a guarded fortress. Jerusalem's religious leaders were not at ease. Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 through 66, records that the day after the crucifixion, the Sabbath itself, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate. That detail is significant. Going to the Roman prefect on the sacred day of rest demonstrated the level of urgency they felt. They reminded Pilate that Jesus had predicted his own resurrection on the third day and requested a guard for the tomb. Pilate granted it. The Greek word Matthew uses is custodia, a direct transliteration of the Latin custodia, a technical military term. The Roman tomb guard was typically composed of a contubernium of 4 to 16 soldiers, with sentinels rotating every 3 or 4 hours. Each legionary carried equipment weighing between 25 and 35 kilograms: chainmail or segmented armor, bronze helmet, oval shield, short sword, heavy spear. The penalty for falling asleep on duty was the fustuarium, described by the Greek historian Polybius in Book 6 of his Histories, sections 37 and 38. The soldier was beaten to death by his own comrades with clubs and stones. No guard slept. Beyond the soldiers, the stone was sealed. The Roman sealing procedure involved ropes stretched across the surface of the stone, fixed to the side walls with mortar, and stamped with an official seal, most likely the ring of the Roman prefecture. Breaking that seal was the crime of peculatus, sacrilege against the state, punishable by death. Now consider the complete picture: a tomb carved into rock, closed by a rolling stone, weighing between 1 and 2,000 kilograms, the equivalent of a large car, sealed with a Roman stamp, guarded by fully armed professional soldiers whose own lives depended on the success of their mission. And Sunday came. Follow what those women faced before they even left the house. The body of Jesus had been buried in haste. The funerary ritual had not been completed. Luke chapter 23 verse 56 records that the women returned home and prepared spices and ointments, but rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. Mark chapter 16 verse 1 adds that only after sunset on Saturday, when the Sabbath ended, did Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome go out to buy the aromatic spices. They bought them at night in the dark, in a city packed with pilgrims, carrying the weight of the most devastating grief they had ever experienced. Examine the physical state of these women: 2 days without adequate sleep, eyes swollen from continuous weeping, undernourished. Jewish mourning included fasting. They had witnessed the crucifixion from only meters away. They had seen the nails, heard the screams, watched the death. Then they had been confined throughout the entire Sabbath, unable to do anything, unable to complete the funerary rites, unable even to go out and buy what they needed. 36 hours of forced paralysis while carrying the most intense trauma of their lives. And still they got up. John chapter 20 verse 1 records that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early in the morning while it was still dark. Dawn in Jerusalem in early April comes around 6 in the morning. Civil twilight, when there is just enough light to walk, begins around 5:30. Mary left before that. She left in darkness. The temperature at that hour was approximately 9 to 11 degrees Celsius. Jerusalem sits at nearly 800 meters above sea level, and April nights still carry the cold of recent winter. There was dew on the stones, possibly a light mist over the Kidron Valley. Witness what these women carried: flasks of myrrh oil, additional linen cloths, aromatic spices. Mark chapter 16 verse 3 records that they were talking among themselves about a concrete, practical problem: the stone. They knew it was enormous. They knew they could not move it on their own. Archaeologist Amos Kloner identified only 4 tombs in all of Judea from the Second Temple period that used a circular rolling stone. It was a luxury reserved for wealthy families. The stone ran in a groove cut into sloping ground so that closing was relatively easy. Gravity helped. Opening required rolling the stone uphill along the groove. Jerusalem limestone has a density of 2,200 to 2,500 kilograms per cubic meter. A stone 1.5 meters in diameter and 40 centimeters thick weighed more than a metric ton and a half, the weight of an adult hippopotamus, and the women were walking toward it knowing they had no way to move it. They did not know about the guard. They did not know about the seal. They went anyway. Matthew chapter 28 verses 2 through 4 records what happened before they arrived. There was a great earthquake. An angel descended, rolled back the stone, and sat upon it. His appearance was like lightning and his clothes white as snow. The Roman guards, the same soldiers trained to face death without flinching, trembled and became like dead men. Men carrying 30 kilograms of armor, whose profession was to show no fear, whose training included marching 40 kilometers a day under full load, fell prostrate before what they saw. And then the women arrived. Mark chapter 16 verse 4 records that when they looked up, a detail suggesting they were coming along an ascending path, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. It was very large, Mark adds. They went in. Luke chapter 24 verse 4 describes two men in dazzling garments. Mark chapter 16 verse 5 describes a young man seated on the right, dressed in white. The message was direct. Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified one, was not there. He had risen. The fear they felt was not the calm reverence that is usually imagined. Mark chapter 16 verse 8 records that they fled from the tomb, seized with trembling and astonishment, and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Real fear, visceral fear. The fear of someone who has seen something that does not fit inside human comprehension. But the story did not stop at fear. Mary Magdalene ran. John chapter 20 verse 2 records that she went to Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved and said that someone had taken the Lord from the tomb. Her first interpretation was not supernatural. It was practical. Someone stole the body. Peter and John's response was immediate. Both ran together. John chapter 20 verse 4 records that the other disciple ran faster and arrived first, an irrelevant detail in a fabricated narrative, perfectly natural in an eyewitness account from someone who remembered losing the race. John arrived first but did not go in. He stooped and saw the linen strips lying there. Peter arrived after and went straight in, behavior entirely consistent with the impulsive temperament of Peter documented throughout the rest of the texts. What Peter found inside the tomb changed everything. John chapter 20 verses 6 and 7 describes the Othonia, the linen wrappings, lying there, and the sudarium that had been over Jesus' face folded in a place by itself. The Greek verb keimena, used to describe the position of the wrappings, suggests they were flattened in the shape of the body, but empty, not unraveled, as if someone had unwrapped them, not torn away as if there had been a theft, collapsed, as though the body had simply ceased to be there, and the sudarium separate, folded neatly. A tomb robber does not separate the sudarium and fold it. A body revived by human hands does not leave the wrappings intact in the shape of a body. John entered after Peter. He saw, and he believed. John chapter 20, verse 8. The entire chamber still smelled intensely of myrrh and aloes. More than 30 kilograms of spices saturated the air in that confined space of just a few cubic meters. Morning light was beginning to enter through the low opening of the tomb, illuminating the white limestone. The two men left. They went home, and Mary Magdalene stayed. John chapter 20, verses 11 through 17, records the scene that followed. Mary was weeping outside the tomb. The Greek verb kleiousa describes active, audible weeping, not silent tears. She stooped to look inside and saw two angels in white, seated where the body had been, one at the head, the other at the feet. They said a single sentence to her. She turned and saw a man standing there. She thought he was the gardener. The confusion is perfectly understandable. It was dawn, her eyes were blurred from weeping, and the last person she expected to see was Jesus. She asked, or rather pleaded, for that man to tell her where he had taken the body, and then he said a single word, her name, Mary. She responded with a word that John preserves in its original Aramaic, Rabboni, not the simple rabbi teacher. Rabboni is the emphatic Aramaic form meaning my great master, a word laden with intimacy, reverence, and instant recognition. 2.5 years of shared life compressed into 4 syllables. The voice was unmistakable. Jesus responded with an instruction that reveals the transformed nature of his presence. Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. John chapter 20, verse 17. Something was different. The body was real. It could be seen, heard, recognized, but it no longer belonged to the same set of rules. Then comes another episode that took place on that same Sunday, and which reveals something extraordinary about how events were processed by those who lived them. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35, records that 2 disciples were walking that afternoon to a village called Emmaus, 60 stadia from Jerusalem. The Greek stadion measured 185 meters. 60 stadia equals approximately 11 kilometers. The distance between the center of Jerusalem and the beach at Copacabana in Rio de Janeiro. A 2.5 to 3 hour walk over the broken terrain of Judea. One of the disciples was named Cleopas. The other remains anonymous. They walked discussing everything that had happened. Jesus joined them on the road. Luke chapter 24 verse 16 records that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. They walked together. Jesus listened to their account. Cleopas described the crucifixion, the burial, the news from the women about the empty tomb, and added a sentence that condenses all the human disillusionment of that moment. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Luke chapter 24, verse 21. Past tense, we had hoped. They no longer hoped. And then Jesus did something none of them would ever forget. Beginning with Moses and going through all the prophets, he explained what the scriptures said concerning himself across the full breadth of the sacred texts. Luke chapter 24, verse 27, a complete biblical exposition during an 11-kilometer walk. When they reached Emmaus, evening was falling. They sat down to eat. Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and distributed it. At that moment, their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished. Their reaction was immediate. Luke chapter 24, verse 32. Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? And verse 33, they got up that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. That very hour, night, darkness, 11 kilometers back, they ran. The exhaustion of 3 days of grief, the walk out, none of it mattered. The news was too large to wait. And while all of this was unfolding on the roads around Jerusalem, the damage control apparatus was already in motion inside the city. Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 through 15, records that some of the guards went to the chief priests and reported everything that had happened. The Sanhedrin's response was money. They gave the soldiers a large sum and instructed them to say that the disciples had come by night and stolen the body while they slept. The logical contradiction is obvious. If they were sleeping, how did they know who had taken the body? But the most revealing detail is something else. The priests promised to protect the soldiers before the governor if the story of the sleeping reached Pilate's ears. Matthew chapter 28, verse 14. Protection from the fustuarium, protection from death. The scale of the bribe corresponded to the scale of the risk the soldiers accepted. And that version of events, Matthew records, was spread among the Jews to this day. None of the parties involved, not the guards, not the priests, not the disciples, not the women, disputed that the tomb was empty. Everyone agreed on that point. The only dispute was about the reason. Calculate the magnitude of what happened at nightfall that same day. John chapter 20 verses 19 through 23 records that the disciples were gathered behind locked doors, afraid of the Jewish authorities, men in hiding, terrified, without weapons, without a plan, without expectation. And Jesus appeared in the midst of them. He showed them his hands and his side, the marks of the crucifixion, the wound of the spear. Luke chapter 24, verses 42 and 43, adds that Jesus asked for food and ate broiled fish in front of them, a real body, tangible, that ate, but one that had passed through locked doors. Thomas was not present. John chapter 20, verse 24. When the others told him, he responded with the most humanly understandable demand possible. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. 8 days later, Jesus appeared again. Thomas touched and spoke 4 words that summarize the conclusion of someone who personally examined the evidence: my Lord and my God. John chapter 20, verse 28. And that was only the beginning. Paul, writing to the community in Corinth about 20 years after the events, lists the appearances with the precision of a legal deposition. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 5 through 8. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom, Paul adds, were still alive at that point, then to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all to Paul himself. More than 500 simultaneous witnesses, the equivalent of filling a mid-sized municipal theater, all affirming they had seen the same thing, the majority still alive and available to be questioned when Paul wrote. Now, observe what modern archaeology confirms about the site. In 2016, the team from the National Technical University of Athens carried out the first opening of the marble slab over the burial bench inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre since at least 1555. The slab measured approximately 1 meter 72 centimeters in length. Beneath it, they found a second slab, and below that the original limestone bench hewn from the rock. Carbon-14 analysis of the mortar between the slabs revealed a date of approximately 345 CE, the period of Emperor Constantine, confirming that this site has been continuously venerated since the 4th century. Earlier excavations in the 1960s and 1970s had already confirmed that the site was outside Jerusalem's walls in the 1st century, a mandatory condition for Roman executions. Discoveries from 2022 found ceramic fragments from the Second Temple period and evidence of agricultural use beneath the basilica's nave, a garden, exactly as John chapter 19, verse 41 describes. The entire city vibrated that Sunday with contradictory versions of the same incontestable fact. The body was not there. The guards had one story. The women had another. The disciples, locked in a room, had none at all until Jesus appeared among them. Jerusalem, with its 200 to 300,000 temporary inhabitants, its streets choked with pilgrims, its political tensions between Rome and the Sanhedrin, its extra soldiers deployed to maintain order during Passover, that entire massive structure of control had failed to keep a dead man inside a sealed tomb. No engineer calculated for that. What makes this Sunday different from any other event in antiquity is not only what happened, but who witnessed it. Not generals, not philosophers, not priests. The first to know were women whose testimony in 1st century Jewish culture was not even admissible in a court of law. If anyone were inventing a story to convince the ancient world, they would never have chosen women as the primary witnesses. That detail, more than any other, carries the weight of authenticity, because no one fabricating a narrative would begin it with the link their own culture considered the weakest. Consider what the disciples did afterward. Men who had been hiding in fear who had abandoned Jesus at the crucifixion, who had not believed the women when they brought the news, who demanded physical proof. Those same men, weeks later, were preaching publicly in Jerusalem that Jesus had risen from the dead, in the same city, before the same authorities, within meters of the empty tomb. And they did not stop when they were threatened. They did not stop when they were arrested. They did not stop when they were flogged. According to the historical tradition preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea and other early church historians, most of them died because of that claim. People die for things they believe to be true, but no one dies for something they know to be a lie, and the disciples were in a position to know. Gethsemane still stands today. The 8 oldest olive trees in the current garden were subjected to DNA testing in 2012 by the University of Tuscia in Italy. All are genetically identical. They most likely sprouted from the roots of the original trees that the Romans cut down during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The roots survived, they re-sprouted, they continue bearing fruit nearly 2,000 years later. The garden measures only 1,200 square meters, barely larger than a basketball court. But its roots predate any cathedral, any denomination, any council. What those women did not know, in that frozen pre-dawn, carrying spices to anoint a body that was no longer there, was that their steps through the darkness of Jerusalem would echo across 20 centuries. They did not know the stone had already been rolled away. They did not know the guards had already fallen. They did not know the linen was empty and the sudarium folded. They did not know that the first person to see the risen Jesus would be a woman, and that this detail, considered a weakness at the time, would become one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire narrative. They did not know that more than 500 people would see the same man alive in the weeks that followed. They did not know that 2 disciples would walk 11 kilometers beside him without recognizing him. They did not know that Thomas would place his fingers into the wounds and speak 4 words that would become one of the oldest creeds in Christianity. They knew none of it. They only knew that they loved someone who had died and that they needed to care for his body. And so they got up in the dark, in the cold, with their hearts destroyed, and they went. And the tomb was empty.